Well, we have a very interesting question for today in our answer series. And listen, here's the deal. This question has actually come to me many, many times in my ministry. And it usually comes to me right after someone has lost their favorite pet of many years, or they had to put their pet down, or for some whatever reason their pet has died. And so this question comes, and the question is this: will there be sacrifices when Jesus comes to live in Jerusalem as the king? Now, this is very interesting because the actual question that I got was exactly the same. Will there be sacrifices when Jesus comes to live in Jerusalem as the king? Now, here's the reason why this is so hard, folks. It's hard because we, in this modern age that we live, we become very, very close to the animals that are around us. But for those who live out on the farms and raise cattle for meat production and chickens and all that, they understand this process. And if you even go back just a few decades, back to the 50s and 60s, most people in the United States, not in the metroplexes, but in the small cities and out in the countrysides, they all understood that animals are in the food chain and that they are important to the food chain in one way or another. Well, this question here, will there be sacrifices when Jesus comes to live in this new king in Jerusalem? Whenever I think about this question, I need to say to you, I immediately have a conflict between the substance behind the title of the lesson and the question. You know, what's the timing of when they're talking about here? Because there are two times that we talk about Jesus being on earth here as the king. One will be the fulfillment of the prophecy of the peace of Jerusalem, when the Lord will come to Jerusalem and reign for 1,000 years as King of Kings and the Prince of Peace. The other one will be the fulfillment of the prophecy of the culmination of the ages, when forever the saints will dwell with God here on earth and with Jesus. Now, in between the two is the total eradication of sin for all eternity done away with. Now, I want to show you a chart here. This is a timeline. And I want to show you this because I want to show you where you are, where we are here, and where we're headed into the future. Now, you notice the timeline begins, and I've got this divided into 1,000 years. In that first 1,000 years, at the beginning of the first 1,000 years was creation. You go into the second 1,000 years, and all the evil humans are destroyed by water in the flood. That's the flood with Noah, and that's where it falls in the timeline from creation to eternity. And then you go into the next 1,000-year section, and you see the Exodus early in the third 1,000 years. And then in the fourth 1,000 years, you see the birth, the life, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. Then from that point, there are 2,091 lunar years, not solar years, but lunar years to take us to where we are right now. The chart says, you are here. Okay, so we're in that 6,000-year period right now, and we're just a little ways down into it. All right, when we hit the 7,000-year mark, Armageddon happens. Satan is bound and thrown into the abyss, and the Lord comes to reign for 1,000 years as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and the peace of Jerusalem finally comes to earth. Then what happens is at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is freed. And when he is freed, he is allowed to deceive humans who have never known of Satan for 1,000 years. Then they will all gather around where the Lord is on his throne there in Jerusalem, and they will attempt to take him off the throne. And the Lord will call down fire from heaven to destroy all the evil humans by fire. Now, remember, the promise was the Lord would never destroy the earth by water again, but yet we're still here. Noah was still there. The water destroyed the earth, the world, but what he really destroyed was the evil people on the world. Next thing that will happen is he'll destroy by fire, is the promise, and he will do that after Satan has deceived so many and they try to take the Lord off of his throne. Then there is the second resurrection, which is called the resurrection of the dead, where everyone comes out of torment. They stand before the Lord at the great white throne, and they all go to the lake of fire. As soon as that judgment, the great white throne judgment, is over, all humans are transformed into glorified bodies. We're just talking about humans. Only humans, not the animals, but just humans, transformed into glorified bodies. And we will look up and the new Jerusalem will be coming down, the Lord's home where he has been living ever since before he hung that blue ball of water out there and called it earth. He created his home before he created ours. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It was the heaven first with all that it made up, and that was the New Jerusalem, which is only new when it comes down to the earth. Right now it's the holy city. And heaven comes down to earth, and we will be in that time from then on for all eternity, living in our glorified bodies, and no sin will be anywhere on the earth. Okay, so let's get a closer look at this. Remember, here's the 6,000s. You're here. Armageddon, Satan bound, 1,000 years of the Lord's kingdom. Satan freed, evil humans destroyed by fire, great white throne. We go into 8,000s and beyond. It's the New Jerusalem, and heaven is now not way over there wherever it is. It is now on earth forever. Okay, the first animals and the first animal sacrifice occurred in the Garden of Eden after the sin of Adam and Eve. And in Genesis chapter 3, verse 21, we are told this: "The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. A blood sacrifice was needed to cover the sins of Adam and Eve. And the Lord killed an animal and made clothes for them from skin." That was the first animal sacrifice. The second animal sacrifice occurred when Abel and Cain were presenting an offering to the Lord. And in Genesis 4:4, we learn that Abel brought the fat portions of an animal from his flock for his offering. It wasn't the whole animal because they ate the rest of the animal, but it was just the fat portions around the liver and the kidneys and all of that. And he brought that as an offering to the Lord. Cain's offering was a basket of fruit and vegetables. The Lord accepted Abel's offering. And as far as we know, this is the second offering of an animal sacrifice here on earth, sacrificed to the Lord. Okay. Then throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, animal sacrifices are mentioned as burnt offerings in the stories of Abraham and Jacob. However, there's no instructions from the Lord about how to do these burnt offerings in the book of Genesis. One thing is sure, they were voluntarily done at the will of Abraham and at the will of Jacob, and by no means were they directed by the Lord. Just go read the context of the story. Abraham and Jacob decided to give a burnt offering unto the Lord. So therefore, they were presented in the manner which Abraham wanted to present it, and as Jacob wanted to present it, as best they knew how to offer them. And get this, the Lord read their hearts and he accepted the offerings. That's the animal sacrifices through the rest of Genesis. The rest of Genesis. The animal sacrifices in the establishment of the nation of Israel was different. In the establishment of the nation of Israel, the Lord set in place his laws, as you know, the 10 Commandments and the other laws, which included those things which the Lord considered sins and which the Lord considered blessings and that he approved of. And in the things that he considered sins, he made the point to say this, that sins could only be covered by the shedding of the blood of animals for the remission of sin. Now, to regulate his laws, the Lord selected a tribe, and that was one of his 12 tribes, 12 sons of Jacob. One of his sons was named Levi, and he selected the tribe, the descendants of Levi, to be the priest, his priest, to regulate the adherence to his laws. And the reality is, if if you couldn't follow the law or didn't understand the law, you went to the priest. The priest was the final verdict on everything about the law. So to set boundaries around this priestly tribe of Levi, the Lord did not allow any Levite families to own property. They couldn't own houses, they couldn't own cattle, they couldn't own land, they couldn't own crops personally at all. The Lord required that every Levite family's livelihood depended on the contributions that came to them from the other 11 tribes each year. Regarding the size of the needs of these families for food and sustenance, in Numbers chapter 3, verse 39, we are told that a census was taken in the second year out of Egypt. We don't know about later on, but we know right now coming out of Egypt, and it showed that there were 22,000 males 1 month old and upward in the tribe coming right out of Egypt 1 year. The count does not include their wives. The count does not include their sisters. The need was great for food, and they could not own anything. They had to rely on the contributions in the form of what's called tithes and offerings. And so the Lord has put a system in place called tithes and offerings to provide the income and the needs of those members of the tribe of Levi. Now, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Lord establishes the nation of Israel as His elect nation to be His biological family when He comes to earth in the future as a babe to die on the cross as the final sacrifice for all sins. So until this Jesus comes, all past sins before that, when Jesus comes, an offering, and it has to be made for the remission of sin and to cover that sin, so it will be forgiven by the Lord. Now, it was established that was established in the Garden of Eden that the Lord required the shedding of blood for the remissions of sin. And the sin was eating from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if you remember. So He shed that bull's blood to make the clothing for Adam and Eve to cover their sins. Now, the chart I'm showing you right now is actually a chart of how the nation of Israel was told to camp everywhere they were. Levi was right in the middle. To the east was Judah, the head tribe. And then the rest of the tribes were around the edges, just like this. And by the way, Joseph's 2 sons took his place. So you don't see Joseph on this chart because he gets a double blessing. And so his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, became the double blessing and are in the list of the 12 tribes. All of those 12 tribes around Levi supply the food and everything. Now, really, Manasseh and Ephraim are the split up tribe of Joseph. So when we say the other 11 tribes, remember Joseph's tribe was one of the 11 and it split into 2, so now there are 12. Okay, so what was put in place was tithes and offerings. Let's handle tithes first. Tithes means, the word tithes means 1/10, 10% of each year's crop. Be it barley, be it wheat, be it grapes, be it pomegranates, etc., be it sheep, whatever. 10% of all the year's newborn animals, sheep, cattle, goats, doves, whatever. 10% of the new crop for that year, or the newborn animals that year, from each family of the 12 tribes, the 11 tribes, but really 12 splitting up Joseph's, were given to the tribe of Levi. And these tithes were to be delivered to the nearest Levitical city in the Promised Land, near where they were living. And then, once it is there at that Levitical city, the Levites who were assigned to that city, there's basically 4 in every tribal area. There's actually only 3 in one of them, and there's 5 in another one, but that's okay. It's basically 4, kind of to average it out, where the Levites who were assigned to be in those areas would take those tithes and they would distribute them equally amongst all the Levi families in that area. the Lord established 48 Levitical cities in the Promised Land. Now here's a map of that. You see that there? That's the 48 Levitical cities. I want you to notice that Shiloh is not on that map because it's not a Levitical city, but that's the place where the tabernacle was for many, many years. You'll also notice that Jerusalem is not on that map because it was not a Levitical city either, even that's where the tabernacle ended up, and that's where the temple was built. These tithes were sent to the 48 Levitical cities in the Promised Land. Yet the tithe, get this, of every third year were also distributed to the widows and the orphans and the strangers. Now the need for the widows and the orphans was not that great because they lived in family units. And they didn't stray from their family units. They lived on their family land, which always belonged to their family as it was given to them when Joshua split up the land. So everyone took care of their family. But if there was any widow of any stray family or orphan or whatever, these tithes of every third year was to help provide them and then provide for the strangers that would be passing through. In addition, each month, from the Levitical cities, one of the tribes of the Levitical city, one section of tribes, remember there are basically 4 Levitical cities in a tribal area. One tribal area would send 10%. In fact, it is the best 10% of what came in. They would send that to the tabernacle to be used there for the morning, the evening, the daily, the monthly, the yearly, and the special burnt offerings. And you can see that in the passages that are in your notes there of where you find that. So what we're saying is, one month it's time for Reuben to send 1/10 of what was given to the Levitical city. Then the next month Naphtali would send what was 1/10 of what was given to the Levitical city. And then Judah would send, and then Simeon, and then Benjamin, and then Manasseh. So each 12 months of the lunar year, one of the tribal areas would send 1/10. Well, actually, it's the priest or the Levites from that tribal area would send 1/10 of the offering from each of the grain. When all the stuff doesn't come in all at one time, by the way, because there's different harvest times, and it's the first fruits. That 1/10 is part of the first fruits that comes right off the top and goes to the Levitical city to provide for the Levites. But 1/10 of each tribe's area would go to Shiloh, and then to, by the way, Gibeon, and then on to Jerusalem, depending the time slot. I'm going to show you that to you in a little bit. And when it goes there, that's to be used for the regular offerings there. There is no way on this earth that the tithes of all the nation of Israel could be taken to the tabernacle and to be herded. Just the personnel wasn't there. The head priest, Aaron's sons, the high priest, Aaron's sons, and those who were all the high priests and their families lived in the tabernacle and at the temple, and there just wasn't enough help to manage all the wheat and everything. I mean, you're talking about a nightmare. This is almost like when we have Hurricane Ike and everybody starts dumping their old clothes and their socks and their shoes and everything and bringing in all sorts of supplies onto 15 people, and you end up with 18-wheelers and just a few people trying to handle it. That couldn't happen away. So it went out to the different divisions, and then 10% came back to the tabernacle area. Okay, so here's the timing of the cycle, and I want you to notice some things. Okay, the 10% of the tithes of all the animals, now that's just animals, born during the year, went to the giving to the local area, Levitical city that was near to the people, okay? That's the animals. Now, as far as the fruits and the grains, the tithe of 10% went every year on years 1 through 6. That's the reason. The reason for that is the law of the Lord is every 7th year you do not plant, you do not till the ground, you do not collect the fruit, you do not do any of that. You let the land rest for 1 year. You see right underneath that, I want to show you this, in year 1 and 2, tithes given to the Levites living in these Levitical cities are to feed and provide for their families. But in the 3rd year, tithes of the third year are given to the Levites living in the Levitical cities to provide for their Levitical families and all the widows and the orphans and the strangers in the promised land for 3 years. And so every 3 years you get enough to last you 3 years to take care of the widows, the orphans, and the strangers. Then in year 4 and 5, it's back to the regular, just goes to the Levitical city for the Levites and their families. It's their pay. And then the 6th year, the interesting thing is, the Lord promises that the crop of the 6th year will be double the size of the previous year. So it will provide for year 6 and year 7. In the 6th year, which is the second of the 3 years, that third year's tithe that goes to the Levitical cities not only provides for the families, but also provides for the widows and the orphans and the strangers for 2 years also. That's the timing of the 7-year cycle of tithing. Okay. And you see all these Levitical cities that are set up and where they are here in this map. This is where the tithes go to. Now the tithes are different from the offerings. The sacrificial offerings were above the tithes. When an individual was going to give a special offering, it was above the tithe. Now I want to tell you, sacrificial animals of the 10% that were sent over to the tabernacle were sacrificed, became sacrificial animals. But most of the animals became food for the Levites to live on. Only the best 10% became sacrificial animals for the regular tithes of the morning offering, the evening offering, all that. No individuals brought an individual tithe or individual offering to be offered as a morning offering, an evening, a noon, or monthly, or whatever. No, that was taken out of the 10th of the 10th. You know, the people gave their 10th, and then the best of the 10th was divided, 1/10 was sent on to be used for these. So the regular offerings for all the festival days did not come from someone bringing it to the tabernacle, whether it was in Shiloh, Gibeon, or Jerusalem, or to the temple in Jerusalem. It was brought from the 10th of the 10th. It came to them. But when an individual wanted or needed to present a peace offering, that means a thanksgiving offering, for saying, Lord, I want to thank you for the bounty that you have given to me. I'm going to give you an offering. Or for a sin offering, Lord, I have sinned. I've sent this terrible sin, and I need to confess my sin and to offer it up and offer an offering up to you for the remission of this sin. Or a guilt offering. Now, there's the sin offerings and the guilt offerings. Basically, they're all guilt. They're all sin offerings. But there's some different ways that you make offerings for either a sin or for a guilt offering. Okay, so the person took that offering and he took it to the tabernacle. It doesn't go to the Levitical city. The offerings go to the tabernacle. And there the person would participate in the sacrifice of the offering for his sin, his guilt, or his thanks offering to the Lord for all his blessings. Now the details of these offerings are found in Leviticus chapters 3 through 7. That's these sacrificial offerings. And so with that, the burnt offerings found in Leviticus 1, the whole animal was consumed on the fire, the whole animal. Now with the peace offering, the sin offering, the guilt offerings, only the fat portions, like I talked about with Abel's offering a while ago, the fat portions of the animal are consumed in the fire. The rest of the animal is cooked, and guess what happens with it? It is used to feed the priest and the line of the Levites who are serving and helping there in the tabernacle area. And get this, it is also used to feed the visitors to the tabernacle area when they come. In other words, there's not a Buc-ee's or I shouldn't say that, there's not a McDonald's or anything like that where you could go buy a meal once you got to the tabernacle. Once you got there, you made your offering, you would eat of that offering with the priest in some of the situations. Not all of them, but in some of them. And then in some of the situations for the sin and guilt offering, the offering had to be consumed on the complex of the tabernacle. But in other situations, that offering, once it's cooked and everything, could be taken back with the family back into their homes there around the complex of the tabernacle, where it could be shared with other people who lived nearby. All those are detailed in chapters 1 through 7 of the book of Leviticus. Okay, so it is allowed to be eaten as meals for the Levites. So, as I told you, here's the map of where the offerings go to. For about 400 years, the first tabernacle sat in Shiloh after they came and got the promised land, okay? And then for 40 years, it sat in Gibeon. And then finally, third, it went to Jerusalem, where it was there until Solomon built the temple. And after that, it went on there. And that's where the offerings were brought to there in Jerusalem. Now, the sacrificial offerings began in 1464. And they came to an end in 70 AD when Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. At the time, the Jewish leadership then changed the offering system and the tithing system, by the way, to what they call a rabbinic system that is still in use today. You see 30 AD, that's Christ dying, resurrection from the grave, and ascension into heaven. And then 40 years later, when Titus destroys the temple in Jerusalem, the sacrifices come to an end. Here's that chart, and you can see that. Now, the tithing system is a little bit different. The tithing system, which was put in place in 1464 BC, came to an end in 586 BC when the whole nation of Israel had been exiled over into Babylon and into Persia. Then, in 536 BC, when Cyrus the Great allowed Israel to go back to the promised land, they went back to the tribal area that's called Judah. They all went back to the tribal area that's called Judah. They didn't go into the rest because that was owned by other people at the time, people in the Persian Empire, old Babylonian Empire, Persian Empire, who were living there. So they went back to the tribal area of Judah, which is where Jerusalem was. And so over the years, the Israelites were allowed then to move north and go live up in the Galilee area and the area that's above the Samaria section. And during this time, the tithing system returned. However, all tithes at this time do not go to the Levitical cities because there are no Levitical cities. Israel doesn't own the land to establish Levitical cities. And so all the tithing goes back to the temple in Jerusalem. This system had to be modified of tithing. So those who lived far away were allowed to sell their offering up in Galilee or whatever and to change it into money so that they could take the money down to Jerusalem and they could go down to the temple market and exchange it for temple coins so they could donate it, or at the temple market they could buy animals or grain or whatever to donate to get back, bring actually a physical offering that they had sold. And this change facilitated what ultimately becomes what Jesus calls the den of thieves, which infuriated the Lord. But be that as it may, the Lord recognized the misuse of the tithe by the Jewish leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, but simultaneously spoke of the proper use of the tithes there in Matthew 23 and Luke chapter 11. So here's the timing of the tithes, just to sum it up again. It begins in 1464. It stops in 586 for a period. It starts back up in 536. By the time it gets to the cross, it is a den of thieves in the exchange system. The tithing system has caused this marketplace that Jesus called the den of thieves. Now, during the 1,000 years of the reign of the Lord, the 12 tribes of Israel will live on the designated land for each tribe as described in Ezekiel chapter 45. Okay, so we've now jumped from the tithing and the offering, and those offerings are sacrificial offerings, by the way, still in the time of Jesus. Now we've jumped to the 1,000-year reign of the Lord. Armageddon has just happened. The Lord begins to reign for 1,000 years, and the 12 tribes are going to live on designated land that was all promised to be part of the Holy Land. Now you'll notice on this chart, it starts with Dan, goes all the way down to the bottom, stretching all the way across on the land that was all supposed to be part of the Promised Land, from the Euphrates River to the Nile River, but Joshua didn't get it all taken whenever he was in control, and so never in Israel's history have they controlled all of this land. Now, that's Actually, the little caveat to that is that during the life of David, all that northern section and almost all of that southern section had other countries living there, which David put under his control and caused them to have to pay taxes. But it wasn't part of the promised land owned by Israel. Those countries owned their own land, and that became a very disastrous decision. In fact, during the time of Solomon, he controlled those countries too, making them pay taxes and come with forced labor and all of that type of stuff. But Israel didn't own that land, and then that became disastrous when the nation of Israel split into the northern and the southern kingdoms. Okay. During the 1,000-year rule, the Levite priest returned to the original rule that they cannot own houses, lands, crops, or animals. They and their families will live totally on the donations of the other 12 tribes, just as they did when they controlled the promised land. However, Levites will not be stationed in cities across all these tribal areas like they were during the time of the Levitical cities. All the Levites will be living on the holy mountain where the Lord is, that plateau of that mountain where the temple stands. And the Levites will live there in this area. The top of that plateau of that mountain, which will be called Jerusalem, is 50 miles by 50 miles, 50 miles long, 50 miles wide. These Levites will need food and provisions for their families. The Lord will provide those provisions for the priests through the sacrificial system at the time. All the other tribes will bring their tithes and offerings there to that holy portion. The word holy is right over where Jerusalem is. And all the other tribes will bring, the 12 tribes will bring their offerings down to Jerusalem, and will gift them there to the Levites so that they can live out. So here's that timing again. You see it. Creation until eternity and where we are. And we're talking about that 1,000-year period right after Armageddon, and Satan is bound during this period of time. And the tithes and the offerings are brought to the Lord's temple, where he is sitting on his great white throne. It's not the great white throne judgment yet, but he's sitting on his great white throne there in Jerusalem on the highest mountain in the world at the time. That happens at the Battle of Armageddon, when the world begins to change its topography, and the Mount of Olives splits, Jerusalem splits, and an earthquake happens, and the mountain begins to rise to be the highest mountain in the world, and the top of it is flat, 50 miles by 50 miles plateau. Okay, now, as we told you, at the end of that 1,000-year reign of the Lord, Satan will be released from the abyss, and he will be allowed to deceive the people once again. Many will follow him. Satan and his followers will attempt to be removed and attempt to remove the Lord from his great white throne, the throne there in Jerusalem. But the Lord will send down fire to consume them. And immediately the resurrection of the dead will occur, and they will all stand before the Lord on his great white throne. The books will be opened, and no name of any of them will be found in the book of life, and they will all be sent over to the lake of fire. At the end of the great white throne judgment, the Lord will transform all living humans into sinless, glorified heavenly bodies. The New Jerusalem will then be seen coming down from heaven. It sits on earth, and its center, right in the middle of that New Jerusalem, sits right on top of that Jerusalem where the Lord has been reigning. That New Jerusalem, it comes down to sit, is 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles long, and the glow of that city extends 1,500 miles high. The glow will outshine the sun and the stars. It is so bright. The gates of the city will never be closed, because no sin will ever be in the world again. The answer to the question in this lesson is, will there be sacrifices when the holy city returns to earth and sits here, and we will be with Jesus in the New Jerusalem? The answer is no. There will not be any animal sacrifices in the New Jerusalem. So here's where we are. Will there be animal sacrifices when the Lord reigns for 1,000 years? The answer is yes. The sacrifices and the tithes are for the purpose of providing for the Levites, who are restricted and cannot own anything and must do the Lord's service, and that is provided for them by the other 12 tribes. Will there be animal sacrifices when the New Jerusalem comes and for all the rest of eternity? Because whenever the New Jerusalem comes and sits on earth, we are now in heaven on earth. Just like the heaven we'll go to when we die, that heaven where we go to when we die will come to earth, because this is where we're going when we die. We're going to what we will call in the future the New Jerusalem. It will sit down and we will be heaven on earth. The gates will never close, because there's no sin or anything in the rest of the world that we need to be afraid of in the world. And the answer is no. There will be no animal sacrifices when we live with King Jesus and God the Father in the New Jerusalem for all eternity.